I mean, well, anatomy is always a story, regardless of whether we're talking about your liver or your pancreas or your lungs or your diaphragm, which are all things you can find with a scalpel if you have that opportunity, which we do. We teach anatomy through cadaver dissection from time to time. Um, or you can find it with your consciousness, but it's still a story told with a sharp instrument. You're still penetrating into something with a sharp instrument, whether it's a scalpel or your consciousness. And the two conversations are complementary. They're not at odds with each other. Yes, you're not going to find a chakra in a cadaver, right? But in a living, breathing being, yeah, that's an anatomy. It's a story told with that sharp instrument. The more you use your consciousness
Uh-huh.
to cut into your existence and tell these stories, the more alive you become. The more you use a scalpel to cut in and learn about the body, the less it resembles the thing it was when it was alive.
The art of aging mindfully. We train to master our own mind. Namaste, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Art of Aging Mindfully podcast. Here we explore the yogic teachings. We explore the possibility of living longer and extending our health span. But today we explore the work of this guy, this author here. This book I'm holding is a 1 million copy sold book on yoga anatomy from the yoga scientist himself, Leslie Kaminoff. Leslie is an autodidact. He's learned anatomy, body work, alignment. What else? He's an innovator in yoga, and he's not bound by dogma or one particular form. And what I like about him is he's open to revising his ideas as we move through time, as we discover more about the body, as we collate more data about what these practices have done to the first generation of folks who have done them for 30, 40, and 50 years. He's constantly revising his ideas in light of new discoveries. So I admire his candor, his honesty, and his sense of humor on this show. It's been quite a ride. We wave all the way up and down through his personal chronology, through the history of yoga in the West, but we touch on some very deep principles that open my mind up about things like Mula Bandha, the root lock, right? Like, what is it? How do you practice it? What are the benefits of it? I think you'll find Leslie's perspective coming through from a vast amount of practice and teaching experience. So it will be something that you can download in your consciousness, put in your tea and stir it. You can put it in your pipe and smoke it. But when you digest that information, it will impact your practice. And perhaps if you are a teacher, it can unfold and flower in your consciousness in a way that impacts your students and perhaps even your classroom. So I'm going to title this episode Moving into Good Space, and you'll see why when I ask Leslie the question, what is the point of all this physical stuff that we do with our bodies? He goes into a neat space that I haven't thought about, and I think you will really enjoy on this episode. So without holding back much more, I want to encourage you to follow up with Leslie's work. All of the links to his work where you can study more with him are in the show notes, and consider becoming a patron to the Art of Aging Mindfully podcast to unlock benefits, right? To practice with me weekly live on Zoom. You'll go to patreon.com/Jai Sugaram. The link is in the show notes again, and consider becoming a supporter. This is a patron-supported podcast. So listeners like you, I don't know if you're driving somewhere right now. I don't know if you're sitting on your couch. I don't know if you are going to the bathroom. Whatever you are doing, I hope you are composed. I hope you're using these practices we talk about to find centeredness and help you make meaning of this crazy world we are living in what is it, July 11th, 2024. You and I are spiraling very quickly into the future. And the future, I think, is not written. We are writing it together. And these ancient teachings are being updated and modernized in a way that integrate in our life in a practically oriented manner. So let's get going with episode 70 of The Art of Aging Mindfully with Leslie Kaminoff. Enjoy the show, everyone. So here we are. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm warm. I'm in the thick of summer here. Where are you, in Manhattan?
I'm on 94th and Broadway. I've got the you can see the AC in the background there.
Yeah,
and I've got a little fan here blowing on me. So
I could have set up a little fan. I have an AC cranking over here. The heat rises in my house.
So you're not in the basement then, I take it?
No, I'm in the attic.
Well, it's just part of you sweating for a living, right?
That's it. Sweating for a living.
Yeah. Consider that a possible title for your eventual autobiography.
Well, I'm on your heels. 1 million copies sold. Congrats. I just got the 3rd edition in. I have to look at it.
Yeah. It's a little daunting to think of what 1 million copies of a book looks like out in the world, especially when the majority of them are, the way we were thinking more than 10 years ago. So it was when we had to do the 3rd edition and we were reading through what we were saying 10 years prior, we had to change a lot of the language because we would never say it that way today.
Because of the way it's decompressed and applied, or because the term that, like, tendinopathy is a new term, I realized.
Well, yeah, no, it wasn't nothing on the technical side really had to be changed because we were pretty solid on that. It was more like saying, instead of the diaphragm, we say your diaphragm, right? So the idea was we wanted to embody the conversation as much as possible for the reader. So there were changes of, person. We tried to, use sort of less definitive pronouns when we were able to. And it wasn't because of a political correct thing. It was just that we wanted to open up the possibility that someone would be reading more about their own body parts instead of some abstracted body part out there in the informational universe or the textbook universe. So if I say to you, well, the diaphragm, the domes of the diaphragm descend when you inhale, that's less personal than saying, when you inhale, the domes of your diaphragm descend. That invites you into feeling it inside your own reality. So there's a lot of language like that we.
So it's linguistic framing.
Yeah. And it's the same with cueing. When it's very much directly connected to the evolution of how I would cue students in a practice now versus how I would have done it 10 years ago. I'm using much more invitational language and basically offering people much more, I would say, agency in the experience rather than saying, when X happens, Y is the result. And if you keep getting Y, then their destination Z will occur. And if you look at the ancient yoga text, it's very much written that way. If you practice this breathing thing for this length of a period, you will cleanse your sins to the extent that you can make up for the killing of a Brahmin, which is like the gravest sin you can imagine in the Shastras, right? So that's actually a line from the Yoga Yajnavalkya, they're talking about pranayama and they're saying, oh yeah, do this practice for this length of time, and even the killing of a Brahmin you shall be cleansed from. So, that's pretty, that's not invitational.
Yeah. I want to come back to cueing later. I'm interested in something I heard you, I was at an art opening with a writer, a yoga writer, and an enthusiastic yogi. She writes for the New Yorker.
Uh-huh.
She's a friend, and she may do an article on the new Shala when it opens up next
Cool.
month. But she was bringing up this phrase post-lineage yoga.
Well, that's
And
Theo Wildcroft's thing. That's Theo. She wrote the
who's
book
that?
on Theodora Wildcroft. She's a
Okay.
Brit, and that was her doctoral thesis. And she's the one who coined the phrase. She's a friend, and she would be the one to talk to about that. I mean, the title kind of gives you a sense of what she's on about, you know.
Yeah.
And just having even the most cursory knowledge of, I would say, the current events in the yoga world,
Totally.
guru scene for the last decade or so, or even more, you can get the sense that, yeah, we need to talk about how we can have an authentic connection to this ancient thing called yoga that isn't being third-partied through, you know, through a guru or you know, some intermediary, right?
Yeah, I've heard you talk about the sutras. I've heard you, like you're just mentioning texts you've looked at. And, you know, are you still an atheist before I continue?
You mean, since we last discussed this, has God presented himself to me and urged me of my atheism?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, not really.
Okay. So
Yeah.
what I want to get at before my brain, when we discuss sequencing and things like that, my brain runs algorithms that looks at the idea that there's more than one ways to skin a cat. You can still get the health benefits doing something different or something that might be more efficient. So what's the point of all this yoga stuff we're doing? Is it, like in Eddie Stern's phraseology, would be to hone a special type of concentration? In Sharon Gannon's school, where I taught for a decade of my life, it's enlightenment for all beings by minimizing the suffering to animals. It's a little bit of animal rights activism and vegan diet. So everyone in this day and age has a unique perspective.
How can you teach Sharon for so long and talk about skinning a cat? That's what I want to know.
Because I'm not a vegan anymore. I did it for 7 years devotedly. And then my teeth started to rot. And then I got really, really, really skinny. And then I ordered a steak in Atlanta on a business trip. And I thought it would tie up my entire GI tract. And it went into my body, like it absorbed wonderfully after a 7-year break.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm just curious, you know, like, what is the point of the Vinyasa Krama? What is it, to lead to insight? I can tell you how I use it, but I'm curious, like, what do you use the yoga practice for, or how do you frame the overall objective? Because that'll minimize my brain from running personal trainer algorithms and saying, well, if you put on a weighted vest and go around the block 5 times, you'll have the benefit of 10 sun salutations, you know.
Well, okay, but that still begs the question of what's the benefit of 10 sun salutations? Because you'd have to do them with the proper mantras and bhava facing in the right direction at the right time of day, and have been born into the proper body. Right. So, yeah, actually, there's a pretty simple response to that, which coincides very closely with what my teacher, Desika Char, would say when asked similar questions. And that is, it's to reduce dukkha, you know, it's to get more good space in your body, in your existence, in your life. You know, as you know, dukkha breaks down Sanskrit wise to bad space, dus being bad and ka being space. And so what we're after really is sukha, which is good space. And I think all of the sort of religious enlightenment, spiritual aspirations notwithstanding, that idea can encompass all of that if that's your framework, or none of it if you simply want to be able to put your shoes on better, or get out of bed in the morning without making funny noises, you know. So I think, but you see, but it's not a non-spiritual concept, this sukha versus dukkha conversation, because if you go a little more into the etymology of a word like sukha, it's not just good space. It literally means the good axle hole, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the space at the center of a wheel, and it's not just any space. It's the space that's exactly at the center, because that makes it a good axle hole. You know, like a bad axle hole would be off center. You put it on an axle, and you're going to have a really bumpy ride, and eventually you'll destroy the cart. So, you know, the teaching there is that human beings are kind of like wheels, that unless we have some good space right at the center of our being, we can't join. We can't join the axle in the case of a wheel, or we can't join with the people around us, with our environments in a healthy way. And our internal environment doesn't work well because we can't join the forces of breath to each other, which goes to, speaking of Yajnavalkya, it goes to a definition of pranayama that Krishnamacharya favored, which comes from Yajnavalkya in the 6th chapter. It's pranapana samayogaha, pranayamaha, right? The pranayama is the balanced, the sama yogaha, the balanced joining of the in-breath and the out-breath, right? So it's all very integrated when you look at the way Krishnamacharya on a philosophical, textual, as well as methodological level, integrated all of these ideas into a really unique way of having the breath at the very center of what you're doing.
Yeah, I ask in light of those guru scandals and the fact that most of us are not qualified to be teachers of enlightenment. If you catch us on our worst day, we're pretty bad off.
Who is qualified to be a teacher of enlightenment?
Nobody is. But what I'm saying is, could it be a stretch to say it's a practice for personal insight, perhaps about the nature of reality or your own nature to arise? Could the practice be about that as well?
It could be. It's a question of how deeply are you able and or willing to go. And I don't think there's any prerequisite for anyone to enter into that conversation. You know, I know some really marvelous, amazing people in the yoga world who had their entree to it through studying, teaching, and working in the gym, in the fitness industry. You know, like I've met people that have gone through Beth Shaw's program and training, who have become amazing yoga teachers and even yoga therapists. Right? That's a yoga fit. Right? That's the thing that she started. And I know people that have been, living for decades at ashrams, and they're still miserable motherfuckers.
Yeah. So that's a good framework. There is space for joy, for sukha, and to minimize dukkha, some of the bad space and the suffering. And we work primarily here with the body and the breath. So I'd like to launch into your chronology a little bit, because I think it's exciting. I didn't know until I listened to the Embodiment podcast that you're actually a body worker.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to know how you got into that. And I think there was a hint that you work with athletes. Oh, yes. Beautiful.
No, I'm in my office.
Nice table. Yes, I want to know how and did you work with athletes? There was some talk about being around the Olympics and treatment of athletes and injuries. So I'd love to learn a little bit about that, when you got the yoga bug. And it's inspiring to me that you've been with the practice this long. Yeah,
I'm going to grab a scrapbook because I can show you some images. Well, yeah, I mean, I took my first yoga class in 1978, so I was 20. It was here in New York at the Shivananda Center. I'm sure you've run across that organization. That was when I first met Sharon and David and Eddie. They and Uma, for that matter, mother of two of my children. For those of you up on your Jivamukti history, I'm talking about Big Uma, not Little Uma. There were two Umas there. Uh, they all went through the Shivananda training back in the day. A Jivamukti teacher in the beginning was a retooled Shivananda teacher, right? And so that was my original training. It was my original yoga experience. And so by 1979, I was up in Canada, north of Montreal, at their headquarters in the Laurentian Mountains, doing my teacher's training course for a month. And I stayed on longer than I was anticipating that summer, because they were organizing this big, what they called a Festival of Inner Light, which was a big sort of gathering of some of Swami Vishnudevananda's Gurubhais from Rishikesh, and other special guests who were talking on topics ranging from, crystal healing to psychic, phenomenon. And it was pretty wild in those days. And so, they needed to build a stage. They didn't have a stage. They had to build one. So I helped with that. And somewhere in the process of building the stage, I just happened to ask somebody who seemed to be in charge. Actually, I know who was in charge. It was Robert Moses. Speaking of Eddie Stern.
Eddie's teacher.
Yeah.
I
Well,
met
then
him a few times.
Yeah. Well, back then he was Swami Shankarananda. And he was in charge because he had originally been trained as an architect, and he knew how to build things and all of that. So I asked him, like, who's your stage manager? And they were like, what's a stage manager? And I was like, okay. So, and I had stagecraft experience. And so I ended up being the stage manager, and I stayed on, and I became like a useful person, like when you're in an ashram like that, and you show any hint of skill or competence at something, you tend to rise through the ranks rather quickly. And that kind of happened to me. And so a few festivals or special events or teacher trainings later, I found myself in India in January of 1981. And it was there that I took sannyas. I got Swami Vishnu to initiate me into sannyas. So I came back a Swami. And they shipped me off to LA, because they don't like to keep swamis in their hometown. Too many attachments, Yeah.
I have such a hard time seeing you as a swami.
Yeah, well, so did my subconscious.
How many years did that last?
Not even a year, 9 months, which is, it's an appropriate gestational period. See, I thought I had a tan, but I'm looking myself next to you, and like I'm trying not to look like a friggin' vampire here.
I was born close to the equator.
I know, or jaundiced. Okay, whatever. So I found myself in Los Angeles as a Swami, and I learned rather quickly that my gung-ho, idealistic, take on my need to renounce the world in order to advance in yoga got a rather severe kick in the ass by reality. The center was on Sunset Strip, by the way. I don't know how familiar with LA
you're in the mix.
Yeah, you know where Chateau Marmont is?
Yeah. Okay,
you could throw a rock and hit the bungalow that Belushi died in from our backyard. That's where the yoga center was.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. And so that was like 1981, Sunset Strip, and it was kind of wild. And I renounced my renunciation toward the end of that year. I stayed on as director for most of the next year, 82, and then I left the organization. And that's when I got involved in sports medicine. It's a rather roundabout.
Were you doing asanas at this point, or were just studying texts and mantras?
No, the Shivananda organization, has like the 5 points, to good living, proper exercise, proper breathing, proper relaxation, proper diet, positive thinking, meditation. That was how Swami Vishnu distilled the yogas and the lifestyle message that he was promoting through the centers and the ashrams and the teacher training programs. And so asana was a part of it, and I did a considerable amount of it when I was in my 20s, and it really did deflect my development of my body and my breath and how I experience living on this planet with gravity in a positive way, which is why when I was eventually able to start a practice as a body worker, I didn't absolutely wreck my body working on other people's bodies, because I had a sense of alignment and movement, even though they don't really teach alignment in Shivanand. It's not like,
no, but if you do the warrior stances, wider stances, you have to watch out for your own back when you do body work. You can't
oh,
be
that's a whole other conversation. Yeah,
leaning over someone and dropping in at that fulcrum point.
Right, and I'm 6'2", so knowing that I had to have the table adjusted to a certain height, and I had I had some really good people training me, but I was also self-taught in so many of the other areas, like the anatomy and so on. I don't know about why this I think that's this thumb up thing. I don't know. It just keeps happening on Zoom, and
it picks it up.
Yeah, I don't know how to turn that off, though. I just don't know where that's coming from.
It's kind of fun. It's cool.
Yeah, but if you go like this, you can get fireworks in the background. It's a little distracting. Anyway,
it's the AI interfering with our lives. It's starting to take over, man.
Yeah, it's desensitizing us to these kinds of intrusions until finally we're full-blown Skynet before we know it.
Yeah. It's 3 years away, so we've got a little time.
3 years, like to hit the timeline from the Terminator movies?
No, 3 years to AGI. It could be any year now, but the timeline I thought was 2050. But Ray Kurzweil thinks it's in the next few years for AGI.
Oh well.
And then it's a self-learning machine.
Well, they're talking about having an AI teaching yoga to people now.
Well, I made an episode called RYTT, Robot Yoga Teacher Training. But I think you and I will be at a premium because it's the AI-proof job. Lawyers, I predict, watch my words, I predict lawyers and doctors will drop before we do. In 5 years, it'll be illegal to not use an AI to diagnose with a doctor. They're going to work in tandem. Lawyers are going to go to the side in 7 years, and they're going to need yoga teachers forever, as long as we have this body. The AI will give better feedback, personalized feedback through suits that we wear, clothing that we wear, biometric, plugged into the AI, and it will be spectacular. It'll be amazing, but the human touch is going to be irreplaceable.
Oh, human touch, yes. But a lot of people are being taught now remotely over the internet. So if you think an AI can do a doctor's job, it can damn well do a yoga teacher's job if it's virtual. So
it can call a kick-ass sequence and give you personalized feedback, but it can't bring in the presence of someone with 30 or 40 or 50 years of teaching experience who really has honed their craft. That's a special energy, and that's going to be at a premium. I think people are going to seek out those kind of things.
Maybe, but if you had an AI virtual guru who was completely virtual, right,
and not biased,
and didn't
want to sleep with you,
and didn't have a dick hiding under the dhoti, ready to spring into action, literally, and had all the wisdom and none of the libido.
Well, I have to say, Leslie, ChatGPT is close, man. Sit down and ask it questions about specific verses from the Gita, and it will blow your mind. It's really surprised me. It's for just learning. It's surprisingly intriguing. If there's mantras from text that you want to look up and talk to it about, it blows my mind.
So the AI Ishvara is where we're headed, because that's a perfect being, not subject to error.
But we might be living in a simulation with the AI supercomputer. That is very possible. It's the top mathematicians on the planet are talking about that seriously.
Right, but the top mathematicians on the planet live in the world of their own equations and would consider it execrable if those equations were attached to anything that existed in the real world. So the way that those people think is custom made for this whole simulation theory. So yeah, I don't buy it. My intuitive internal sense of self makes it self-evident to me that I'm not in a simulation. And I think that's where it begins and ends. But that's how I feel about free will also, because these are the same people who argue against free will, whether we're in a simulation or not.
I'm completely, right? You cooked my noodle. Your idea, I've never heard. I wonder where you got this idea, and I'm going to sit with it for a while in deep thought, is that we develop the soul, that we're not born with the soul. That through
I didn't originate that.
Yeah, where did you get that? That fascinates me and really cooks my noodle, that through our choices we can develop, the soul comes into being. Right.
That actually was related to a quote from Ayn Rand, that we are beings of self-made soul.
Okay.
That's her. And to riff on that, I've extended that into other conversations. For example, when I teach practices, breathing practices, for example, like Kapalabhati, which has a particular nature to it in terms of opening into this vertical channel of movement, which is the nature of the exercise, to create this upward apana that happens. It occurred to me one day that the language of purifying or unobstructing the sushumna is not as potent or embodied, to go back to how we started, as the idea that I'm actually creating the sushumna, the sushumna, that I'm not born with it, right? That it's something that through my own interoceptive and somewhat proprioceptive experience and values that I bring focus to, and it's not like it's already there and it's clogged and I need to unclog it. Because if you look at so much of the literature, it's viewing the body not as the vehicle for liberation so much the obstacle to it. I mean, if you read Shankaracharya and
all of Vedanta does that.
All of Vedanta, but Adi Shankara is particularly like body negative. When you really read what he wrote about this thing being the dwelling place of filth and corruption, and it needs to be
a bag of pus.
Yeah, exactly. And so it becomes the obstacle to your liberation as opposed to the vehicle for it. And I realized that I was in subtle ways buying into that whole ethos with the way I was languaging a simple thing like Kapalabhati. We're cleansing the Sushumna, or removing obstacles, or whatever. But like, what if you don't have a Sushumna unless you make one for yourself? Maybe that's what you're doing. You're literally carving a sensory motor psycho-emotional pathway in your system through repetition, like any other habit, like any other thing that you focus on internally repeatedly, but a positive one that can help bring you a sense of clarity and stability and support. And to me, that links favorably with some of Krishnamacharya's teachings regarding Kundalini and pranayama, and the fact that he views Kundalini not as a dormant energy but as an obstruction. It sits at the base of Sushumna, preventing prana from entering it, right?
So you have to bring in some imagination with these exercises, and as you train your nervous system. So you're co-creating with your body a new 100%. Mental model, I guess. A surgeon can't open you up and see a chakra, but in certain altered states, you can experience, or you can feel the energy of love and acceptance in the heart, which is visceral.
Yeah. I mean, well, anatomy is always a story, regardless of whether we're talking about your liver or your pancreas or your lungs or your diaphragm, which are all things you can find with a scalpel if you have that opportunity, which we do. We teach anatomy through cadaver dissection from time to time. Or you can find it with your consciousness, but it's still a story told with a sharp instrument. You're still penetrating into something with a sharp instrument, whether it's a scalpel or your consciousness. And the two conversations are complementary. They're not at odds with each other. Yes, you're not going to find a chakra in a cadaver, right? But in a living, breathing being, yeah, that's an anatomy. It's a story told with that sharp instrument. The difference between the two is that the more you use your consciousness to cut into your existence and tell these stories, the more alive you become. The more you use a scalpel to cut in and learn about the body, the less it resembles the thing it was when it was alive.
Did you find in your body work blockages, or how do you frame that? What's the phraseology around things that are stuck, or asymmetries or adhesions?
Yeah, well, again, it depends what level you're working on. You definitely can find adhesions in the fascia, in the connective tissue, the result of surgeries or injuries, the way things have healed, the way things have stuck together over time, or just through general aging and wear and tear. So there are techniques that I'm familiar with, that I practice, that I need to practice from time to time with people, that literally is breaking those adhesions on a structural level. Whether it's
back to your chronology, though, I want to talk about how you came into that. Were you taught by yourself, or did you have an apprenticeship? This is probably back in the day before state certifications. Mine, New York has a 1,000-hour program. California, I think, was 3. It's now 5. They vary throughout the country.
You're talking about massage?
For massage and body work, yeah.
Yeah, well, back in the early 80s, when I was in California, and I know some of the people that were involved in this, the massage practitioners, the legit massage practitioners, sought out regulation and licensing to differentiate themselves from prostitution. Because it used to be you had to register with the local police department if you did massage, so they could verify that you weren't giving handies at the end of the session, right?
Right.
So that was something they sought out at that time. My entree was different. I've had a very non-academic education in all the things that I teach,
including anatomy.
Including anatomy, especially anatomy. It's all been on the job, autodidact, following my interest, asking questions, surrounding myself with people who were really smart and who were really good at what they did. Starting at the Sports Medicine Institute, which is where I started working when I left Shivananda in 1982. And so, where I was working at the Sports Medicine Institute, and I was originally hired as an electromedical technician. You see this device here, the electroacuoscope.
Yeah.
This was a device that was brand new back then, and it was being used very successfully to treat soft tissue injuries with microcurrent. Standard PT modalities work in the range of milliamperage. This was working in microamperage. So it was much more akin to the kind of healing effects you would get with needles, with acupuncture. Only it was inducing changes in the tissue that we didn't fully understand.
Is it electrical or vibrational?
No, it's electrical, microcurrent. And eventually these devices went extinct because, it turns out that it's not actually a product, it's a setting. So they just started incorporating microamperage settings on standard PT modalities. And then these things, the market disappeared for those. But that was my entree into sports medicine. And I got a job working at the Sports Medicine Institute in West LA for a guy named Leroy Perry. He's a chiropractic orthopedist who is very well known for working with celebrities and top Olympic athletes. And my workstation was right next to the X-ray station. So everyone that came in the door there as a patient had X-rays, full spine AP lateral X-rays. So I'm seeing hundreds of human spines from the front and the side. go on the light box being marked up by the doctor that was, he was measuring Cobb angles and lumbosacral angles and looking for abnormalities. And, in those days it was a film and you would be writing on pencil on the film. And then that would be handed off to whoever the doctor was that was treating the patient. And, it was used diagnostically to some extent. But when you have an X-ray film that's that long, it's actually not a very accurate image because the X-ray spreads out towards the, and the more towards the edge of the film, the more distorted it gets because it's shooting at an angle, right? So they were really postural studies as much as anything. And I was very curious. And the doctor who was there, I became friendly with him and I just started asking lots and lots of questions. And, he started answering them. And what I was seeing, frankly, made me not want to teach yoga ever again. Because, okay, do you remember in 2012 when William J. Broad wrote that book?
New York Times.
The Times came out with how yoga can wreck your body, that stupid friggin' article. And so you remember how the feeling just swept through the yoga teaching world, like, oh my God, are we killing people? Are we paralyzing people?
That's the year people stopped teaching Shirshasana and Sarvangasana.
Exactly. Well, that's the exact feeling I had back in 1982 when I started looking at these X-rays. It's like, oh my God, if this is how human spines look. At first I thought, okay, these are the people who are coming in for treatment. These are the screwed up people. Those are the only X-rays you're seeing, right? The normal people aren't here because they're not screwed up and the X-rays look like the ones in my anatomy books. So this is the conversation I was having with the doctor. And he said, no, everyone's spines look like this, whether they're in pain or here or not. It's not like in the books. Those are drawings. Those are paintings. That's artwork you've been looking at. But it's not people. This is people. X-rays. That's what it looks like.
People with real lives, sitting, carrying babies.
Living on a planet with gravity, showing, past the age of 20, you're already seeing some arthritic changes and some degeneration of the discs and so on, right? It's just normal wear and tear. And it's like, and I'm trying to picture those spines I'm seeing on the light box in the classes I had been teaching. Because, Shivananda, the first asana is headstand after the sun salutations. And you do your eye exercise and your breathing, whatever. And then you do your sun salutes. And the first asana in that sequence is shoulder stand, followed by headstand, followed by shoulder stand, cloud bridge, fish, right? And it's like, I can't do this anymore. This is just, it's scaring the shit out of me. I'm gonna hurt people.
I'm having that feeling with Chaturanga.
What's that?
I'm having that feeling with Chaturanga now.
Oh, that's a whole other thing with the wrists.
Yeah.
So I stopped. I really stopped for a while, and I got pulled back into it because we had a lot of athletes coming through the place who the stretching methodology was pretty primitive.
Yeah.
And, I had some experience leading people through stretches. And so I started modifying things and doing, not doing the stuff that I thought might be killing people and just doing some sort of flexibility training, not just for the athletes, but for some of the patients who were coming through. Eventually, we had the opportunity to start a full-blown yoga therapy program at the International Sports Medicine Institute. Now, I knew that I was not qualified to run this, but I knew someone who was. He had just gotten his PhD in yoga, and he was running a studio out of the back of his house in Marina del Rey, which is still there.
Where do you get a PhD in the 80s in yoga?
You have to ask Larry Payne about that, because that's who we brought in. Now, Larry, as you may know, is one of the founders with Richard Miller of IAYT, the International Association of Yoga Therapists. And he was someone that I had met and become friendly with. And, we had hung out a bit. And, he was the one that we brought in and started what I think was the first yoga therapy program at a facility like that in the country. It was in 1983 that we did that. And so I brought this. And so, this was you asked about the athletes and everything. So this was the the back cover of one of the issues of the magazine that
Mm-hmm.
the Sports Medicine Institute put out, and you can see there in the center, in the lunge, is me.
The lunge.
Yeah, and my boss, Leroy Perry, is the one with his hand on my shoulder, and that is the really tall guy in the back there. That is Wilt Chamberlain.
No
And then,
way.
Yeah, and then over here, that's the woman. That was my girlfriend. That was the woman I was living with, Linda Huey, who was very close with Wilt. And the guy doing the press with the barbell, that's actually John Smith, who is still the American record holder in the 400 yards. You know, they retired the yards record, so
Meters,
if you had it when they retired it, it's yours forever. And then the guy on the cycle here, that's my bodywork teacher. That's Craig Nelson Benedict. He's the one who taught me bodywork and myofascial release. And
so your career started in the lab with practical experience
as a clinician. Yeah, it was all clinically
and you're
based.
seeing real case studies in real time with real bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. There was and it was a very steep learning curve. I was very, very lucky to be surrounded by all of this. And also just in terms of that era, you know, I think what people who have lived in a world where there's always been a fitness industry maybe don't realize how relatively new it is in the world to have an industry called fitness, because back then in the early to mid 80s was when fitness became an industry, right? And because prior to that, you know, you had gyms, but, you know, weirdos went to gyms and worked out with weights, bodybuilders and strange people and athletes, of course. But it wasn't a mass societal movement. The running craze had been going on for a while, right? But what was coming together in that place and time in Los Angeles in the early to mid 80s, of course, was the Olympics were coming in 1984.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You also had the advent of Nautilus, which is a way for any schmuck to walk in off the street with no experience and work out with weights safely, just by moving a pin and setting the plates. Because prior to that, it's all free weights, and that they're friggin' dangerous, as you know. You know, people hurt themselves all the time with free weights, even people who know what they're doing, right? And you have to be spotted and the whole thing. So, and this is the secret sauce. Jane Fonda.
Jane Fonda blew it all up, baby.
She exploded. She's the only non-engineer to ever receive a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Electronic Engineering Association. You know why? She sold more VCRs than any person in history at the beginning of the VCR era, because people were buying the hardware just so they could put her VHS tape in,
right,
and do the workout. Millions and millions of those were sold. And she was just down the road. She was just down Motor Avenue from where we were in LA. So we got to see the first aerobics injuries, including Jane, who kind of messed up her back doing the Jane Fonda workout. And so all of this was just happening. You know that movie Perfect with John Travolta and Jamie Lee Curtis? Mm-hmm. That was based on the Sports Connection, which was this huge club that you know, it became the new dating scene, right?
Yeah.
We used to call it the sports erection. So all of this is happening in the early to mid 80s, and fitness became an industry. And you know, we were sort of at ground zero with these Olympic athletes who were training for the games, and a lot of them went in and got medals, and a lot more of them got medals than would have had the Eastern Bloc been there with their state-sponsored doping programs.
Yeah,
the women especially medaled a lot more than they would have. Some of those old dirty records are still on the books from that era without an asterisk.
Testing's improved, but there's still ways to beat it.
The more the testing improves, the more the ways of beating the testing will improve.
And someone's just sponsored, this is weird, the enhanced games, which I think is wild.
I think it's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to that.
I think that's wild. I worked in baseball with the Yankees during the steroid rage.
So you saw the shit going on in the locker rooms
in front of me. I was asked to inject guys and stuff, and I never did.
Oh, don't worry. It's just B12. Yeah.
It's just B12 shots, right? But you saw before there was even a teacher training program ever existed, you saw it evolve into where we are today.
Well, that's the thing, right?
There was no yoga teacher training.
No, that happened 10 years later because you know, this 10-year-old fitness industry in the early to mid 90s now started being exposed to the Ashtanga Vinyasa way of doing yoga. It's active, it's fast, it's hot, it's a workout. We want it.
Westerners eat it up.
They eat it up, but here's the problem. And this was where Beth Shaw, who I mentioned earlier with YogaFit, had one of the best business insights ever in our field, because she saw an opportunity. Because at that point, the demand for yoga teachers, try to picture this, a universe in which the demand for yoga teachers far exceeded the supply, right? Early to mid 90s. That's what we're talking about. And they wanted it on their schedule. They wanted people who could teach this, you know, very active, popular form of yoga. And so Beth said, look, you've already got people on your payroll who know how to lead group fitness. They're called aerobics teachers. You give them to me for a weekend. And at the end of that weekend, you'll have yoga on your schedule, because I will teach them to teach a class. And that's YogaFit. That's how it got started. And it was brilliant. And it made people like me, who were lifers, you know, and some friends and colleagues of mine who saw this happening, go, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Someone is training yoga teachers in a weekend. Are we okay with that? Do we think a weekend is enough? And if not, how many hours do we think it takes to produce a yoga teacher? And that's what started the ad hoc committee conversations that happened over the course of a few events. I was at the final one where we sat down and finally came up with the 200 and 500 hour standards. And that was one of the motivating factors, was weekend yoga trainings. So now we're talking like 95, 96.
So were you launched into being an educator of yoga teachers, or did you have a phase where you actually taught Vinyasa yoga and focused on teaching and did you ever have a studio? Did you have that phase in your career, or were you, because of the sports medicine clinic?
No, I had a studio. My first studio was in New York City, and it was open from 1987 until 1992. It was called Yogatone. It was in the East Village on 4th Street between A and B. On the ground floor, in the back, was a little space that this dude had rented to run his bootleg, illegal T-shirt printing business. He had very long red hair down to his ass, and his name was Eddie Stern. And and so I knew Eddie before he was a yoga teacher, because you know, my studio was up on the 3rd floor. He was on the ground floor. So that was my first studio, and we taught not just yoga there, we taught all kinds of movement type stuff. Body mind centering was an early influence for me, because my first wife was at the time the head of BMCA, Body Mind Centering Association, which is the Practitioners Association. So I got to meet Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen quite early on when she was still teaching in Amherst. I told Bonnie back then, every yoga teacher in the world should be doing BMC. This is awesome stuff. This is amazing, right? And it took a while for people to catch on. Donna Fari was one of the first people to write about it in Yoga Journal, about body mind centering, and that became a sort of a strong thread that extended through my other studio, the Breathing Project, which was open from 2003 until 2017, because the person I was running that studio with was Amy Matthews, who I wrote the book with, and she is one of the most senior teachers of body mind centering in the world. And she's responsible for the whole brilliant asana analysis in yoga anatomy. So, you know, I've always been involved in dance and movement and athletics and things other than yoga. So there's always been a sort of a multi-dimensional perspective on the body and movement and training and injury prevention and healing and all of that. So it's all part of the same mix for me.
I'm curious, like when you teach, because I've seen your videos where you're breaking things down in the context of a vinyasa class, right? How much instruction do you give so that it's cursory enough to be adapted? Like press into your feet, strengthen your legs, draw the navel in and up, release into the forward bend. Like before it becomes too individuated to one person. Like I'm in teaching group classes primarily, and I work with one-on-ones privately. And luckily, since the pandemic, Zoom's been a big resource. People have stayed with all the New Yorkers since I moved to the country have stayed with me in Zoom. But in a general class, like I read Brian Kest's book, which was really fun. It was a tear. I ripped right through it in a day and a half because some of it's hilarious. He's a character.
I got to send you a video. We were on Good Morning America on Brian.
You and Brian?
No. We're not together. I mean, they were filming him in LA and I was in New York, but it was the same spot they did on Good Morning America in the 90s. It was like, hey, there's this popular thing that's happening now. It's called yoga because look at there's this whole new active way of doing yoga, and they featured Kest in that spot along with me at my place in New York that I was teaching at after I closed Yogatone.
Well, when you turn 50, everybody sings a different tune, especially hardcore Ashtangis like myself. You have to adapt. You know, it's unforgiving. What I experienced in my 30s, all those benefits are tearing my body apart at 49, and I have to change what I'm doing. But Brian in his book talks about that there are 8 billion ways to do an asana, meaning it's totally personalized and it has to suit the person. And when we're young and rigid, like I'm suited, I'm Indian, I listen to the guru, I bow to my parents, I find a system that works and I do it religiously. That's how I was. And I did all the Ashtanga.
Joyce, when you say guru in connection with Ashtanga,
I mean, like I went around searching New York for a daily teacher when Sharon and David moved to Woodstock. So I did the tour to Dharma Mitra. I was looking for someone to practice with every day. And I found Eddie, and he and I had the connection where I didn't feel that connection to everybody else. And he was like, can you come at 5:30 in the morning? I'm like, yep. And I just gave
Broome Street at that point? Or,
yeah, it was at Broome Street. Yeah, and I studied for a decade with him at Broome Street.
He's back at Broome Street now, actually.
It's so fascinating that he broke that down. A Y7 moved in there and he rebuilt the whole thing. It blows my mind. The emotions one must go through to do all of that, or it's out of control. So the individuation of it versus the group experience, which I'm opening a studio in a month, and I have to also think about meeting the needs of the marketplace and what people are looking for programming wise. And as I turn 50, working more with yin and slowing down and bringing in slower types of, and breaking the practice down in bite-sized chunks. Like 90 minutes of vinyasa is not working every single day like it used to. And I follow the metrics. I wear an advanced fitness tracker. I don't know if you know about the Whoop strap. I get a recovery score based on an algorithm that looks at my HRV, my sleep, my breathing pattern, everything. So I'm having to adapt it, but how much instruction do you give in the sequence, and how do you make it personal and straddle that line? Because classes have an amazing vibe when everyone breathes in the vinyasa together. Like I think Jivamukti Yoga, everything about it is still spectacular if you remove the veganism and some of you make it a little emptier philosophically from the point of view of self-observation and maybe applying these shlokas in a way that they flower in your consciousness. Less preachiness, less diet. But as far as the sequence and the class, it takes you to the moon, man. It's like smoking a joint without smoking a joint.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was there, remember, in the early days when they were ramping up at Second Avenue. And it was extraordinary. And it was a very eclectic, extraordinary moment at least when I was there, but that was before they had a Jivamukti method and did their first teachers training, you know, when they were still experimenting.
It was still Ashtanga based mainly at that time.
It
hadn't really fragmented off.
They were flowing with breath and movement before they went to Mysore. They were already, they came out of a musical kind of performance art milieu, and were already playing with stuff like that before that first trip to Mysore in, like, what was it, 91, 92, into 92 was when they went. Sharon and David and Eddie and Uma. All right, those are the 4 people on that trip when they first went there. So they were already kind of moving in a flowing direction, but then they really sort of zeroed in on the Ashtanga sequencing. And by 93, of course, Pattabhi Jois was teaching at Jivamukti. And so it's a powerful thing, and people couldn't get enough of it. You couldn't get an extra mat in that room.
No, you know, my classes were 75, an inch in between 75 people. I had to step around and over people. It was
that we call that Jivamukti mat spacing, 1 inch between the mats.
1 inch.
Yes, no more. Yeah. It was crazy. I remember when my Uma was pregnant with our son Jai and still going to class there, and she was a little slow getting off of her mat for the next class coming in, and she nearly got trampled by people trying to get a good spot, you know. And it's like it became such a scene.
Major scene.
Yeah, because people were gravitating towards that, and it was powerful, and they were being taken to places that were, like you said, it's trippy. It's trippy. It's like you know, you don't need the drugs. Although I suspect there may have been some of that happening anyway, you know, with some of the students. But you don't need, you see, to answer your question, first of all, I'm going to say the annoying thing that Desikachar would always say 90% of the time when he was asked complex questions, good questions, but complex questions, he would say, it depends. You know, it depends on primarily who you are as a teacher and what your ethos is. You know, like, if you want to pack the room with people who want to get something like that Jivamukti experience we were just talking about, you're going to teach in a certain way, and you're going to be hard pressed. And if you find success doing that, you're going to be hard pressed to change that successful formula, even if you want to. Now, we all evolve as human beings and as teachers, and we want to explore or experiment with different things. But if you have a successful formula, what the other thing Desikachar would say, because we would ask him this all the time, because we would be in a weekend or a week-long thing with him and have our minds blown. And a lot of us ran centers and had clientele and students that we were going to be going back to the next day or two. And it was like, what am I going to do? How do I don't want to keep saying and doing the things I was doing, because now I have this glimpse into something deeper and more powerful, and I can sense that things are changing in me as a result of these practices and ideas that I've been exploring, right? And so what do I do? What am I supposed to do? And that's the kind of, you know, we would ask him, like, what am I supposed to do now? You've completely fucked me up, sir. What am I supposed to do? We wouldn't say that, you know, but what he would say, and I'm paraphrasing, was, when you go back into your life and into your teaching, you have to give your students 90% of what they expect to be getting from you. If you do that, then you can experiment with 10% of the new stuff, or what you want to explore, or what you think they need, right? But give them 90% of what they're expecting, and that frees you up to play with the other 10%. And that was very wise, because number one, if someone is coming back to your class, having already been there, they liked what you did last time. That's why they're back. And if what you're doing today is too different from the thing that they liked, that's going to mess with your business model. On the other hand, you need room to explore, to grow, to experiment. And so, do you risk alienating maybe 10% of the people in the room if you're deviating from the thing they came to do?
No, the programming can be adjusted. Like I'll teach like my Saturday at 10 and Sunday at 10 will be Jivamukti style, but I'll be on the schedule teaching some yin. I really enjoy basics.
But that's a different class with a different title. That's not the same. It's
the same class with the same title. You got to give them the meal. You got to give them the meal they're going to the restaurant to get.
Exactly.
That's fair, and it's they're getting their money's worth.
Right. And the other reason this 90%, 10% thing is good advice for someone just coming back from a weekend or a week-long training or, a festival or whatever, like I saw you at the Berkshire Yoga Festival, right? A lot of the people there were teachers. How many crappy yoga classes do you think got taught in that following week where people were basically regurgitating undigested
new material?
Yeah, because there's a digestive metaphor there. You don't share a meal. You say you use the meal metaphor, but you don't share a meal by eating it and then taking a plate and going, here, this was delicious. You try it. We wouldn't dream of doing that with food, but we do it with information all the time. And so the idea of digesting your experience, your insights, your training, and having it become part of yourselves, and then having it come out in your own voice, from your own experience, from your own embodiment of what you're practicing and teaching is a whole different thing. But it takes time, which is why, maybe it feels like you're going a little bit on autopilot and just, teaching from a script. But, if that's what's paying the bills, then don't.
Yeah, I'm also at a strange place where we talked earlier about veganism, and I look back at it. I thought at that time it was connected to my enlightenment. But I look back at it from a different perspective now as an extreme diet. I was 167. I weighed 167. Now I'm like 197, which is healthy for aging. And it's conscious. And I have a lot of interdisciplinary workouts I do besides asana. I lift 4 times a week. I run twice a week. I hoop twice a week. So there are a lot of asanas. I'm at a point where, should I be calling stuff that I no longer do, even though people come for that? And I used to see videos of Pattabhi Jois teaching in his 60s and his 70s with an overweight body, obviously older, not being able to do the stuff. But it's tricky. I'm at a very weird doorway in my evolution to where I have the knowledge of how to call things out and get people into things with audio cues. But I no longer do like binds and twists. I don't do Marichasana C or D, nothing like that. Like even, just simple binds. I might do a seated spinal twist, but I like having this kind of a body. So it's,
well, I think as long as you're honest and authentic with your students about what you're doing and what your experience is, I mean, it's all there's. Here's the thing, you could be the most informed, educated, enlightened teacher on the planet in front of a room leading a practice. And if there's a person in that class who's determined to hurt themselves, they'll find a way to do it. Yeah. I've been that person. Maybe you have too at some point. I think a lot of people have.
I've been aggressive with it, but it shows you stuff about your personality you have to let that student break themselves, because it's a reflection. I think what's beautiful about the practice is that it's a mirror. It will bring your stuff up. It is not always pretty. Sometimes it's just downright ugly and a giant pain in the neck. But it shows you stuff that you can say, oh, wow, that's how I am. What do I do with this?
Right. As long as you're not the one doing the breaking by jumping on
Yeah.
people and yanking them and shoving them and all of that, but it's I'm a parent, right? I have three boys, and it's a very similar thing. It's like, where do you draw the line between protecting them from hurting themselves, because they're just dumb kids. They don't know about the world. They don't know that thing over there is going to hurt them, right? Where do you draw the line about reaching out and yanking them back so they don't hurt themselves, or creating an environment where they can explore and learn for themselves? You want, because there's a certain amount of like, yeah, that's hot, don't touch it. And once you do, you'll never touch it again. But by the same token, you don't want them to damage themselves in the process of learning. So I think by understanding the dynamics of a learning environment, we can construct those environments in such a way that people have the best shot at learning from their own experience and their own mistakes in a way that doesn't hopefully create permanent damage. And by that I mean there's a sthira and a sukha to everything that lives, right? From the cellular level to the universal level. It's just a lens. Once we look through it, we can see that's how life and existence stays into balance. It's a balance between sthira and sukha. And in a learning environment specifically, I've come to understand that the sthira is the structure, the thing, the technique that you're learning. It's the thing that's being taught, right? Whether it's an asana or a vinyasa or a breathing exercise, whatever it is, there's a structure to it. And because there's a structure to it, it lets you know where you are in relation to that practice. Can I do it? Because every technique that you attempt to do that you don't already know how to do, that technique is asking a question of you. It's saying, can you do this? Are you able to do this? Can you raise this without tensing that? Can you engage here and disengage there? Can you engage your lower belly and make energy go up instead of squeezing in and pushing down like you're pooping? That's the question Palabadi asks, right? So, and because it's asking that question, a technique can have, you can do it wrong. You can not be getting it. And that's important, right? To know where you are in relation to this new thing. But that's the sthira, that doesn't constitute a complete learning environment, because what's the sukha? The sukha is the spirit of inquiry. It's the thing to which there is no wrong answer. Because
it's a mystery.
Yeah, because the question that inquiry asks is, what are you noticing about this? When you try to do that, what are you noticing, right? And there's no wrong answer to that question in a classroom. What are you noticing? There's no possible wrong answer. Even if you spaced out and didn't hear the question, but you noticed that that's what you did, that's beautiful. That means you noticed that your mind drifted, right? If you're confused, that's not wrong. Desikachar would always say that the recognition of confusion is itself a form of clarity. Like, how many people are ever fortunate enough to be aware of when they're confused about something? That's
Western minds, though, don't like the process and like not knowing. We're not used to mystery. We like to break things down and assimilate them as quickly as possible. And
Sure. Some people gravitate more towards the technique because they want the structure. They don't want to think for themselves. They don't want to be embodied. They want to be told what to do and how to do it, and what they're going to feel as a result of doing it, right? They don't want that much agency. And people like that definitely come to yoga classes. And the more you try to hand them your agency, the more frustrated they're going to get, because all they want is to be told, right? And those are the people who, at least 10% of the time in a class like that, need to be asked, what are you noticing? And notice if you're having trouble noticing, right? That's fine. Now, by the same token, there's other people who only want to go do you've seen them in class. They're doing their own practice, regardless of what you're saying. They're into whatever they're into, and they're feeling something, and they're going this and that. They don't want any structure at all. And the more you try to get them to do the thing that you're actually there to teach, the more frustrated they're going to become. Or maybe another version of that is, maybe they're trying, but they are so disembodied, right? They're so unable to bring their prana into their own bodies, right? Because they're dissociated, that the question, what are you noticing, doesn't even make sense to them, because that for them is a source of anxiety, to focus on what's going on inside.
Yeah.
So you have people from both ends of the spectrum, and they show up in the same class. And the only way that they would, those two extremes types of people would get something positive out of the same class, is if the teacher understands that there's a balance between the sthira and the sukha, between the structure of what it is you're learning and the inquiry that is applied to the act of learning. So there's always something for them to be comfortable with, and then there's something that'll challenge them.
Yeah, the overarching thread to me is successive approximation, that you don't have to get it perfectly right the first time, the first week, the first month, that it's an ever-evolving process. It's unfolding.
Yeah, if you could get it right away, then there would be no point in learning it. You're already good at that thing.
Yeah.
It's like the hypermobile people who come to class. It's a good example, right? And they're already way too flexible, and they can fold their body into any shape that you ask them to put it in, right? So they're already good at yoga. They don't need yoga. No, they need a whole other way of practicing, that doesn't involve going to your end range. They need it more than anyone else, but they don't need the asana as stretching their bodies into extreme positions. They need to learn about boundaries. They need to learn what it's like to work at something less than their end range, right? And so, again, an understanding of a learning environment as a balance of this sthira sukha is really, really important for educators and for the students to get benefit, to get the maximum benefit and avoid the potential risks.
That's a really cool explanation of sthira and sukha. You were mentioning something before that it's really important for me to backtrack to, because I'm doing some experiments with assists and not assisting. And since the pandemic is over, I noticed that there's a trend to back off on assisting. But you and I are overqualified to assist, given our background with the body, touch, how there's different ways of touching. They're not all about prodding and pushing and pressing. Sometimes it's just about a line of energy. And I've seen you work on the videos with touch, and it's extremely powerful. Is it something you think that I should not teach in a training anymore? Like, sometimes I use touch to teach the assist, to teach alignment, because it's a double whammy. You get the lines of energy, and you create a deep memory, a visceral memory of what an asana feels like. And it's also very suggestive, where the other way is very Iyengar like. I heard Iyengar had 340 cues for Parsva Konasana, which is just out of control, and they were all written out. I'm like, to me, that's way too heady, as if I step on the outside edge of the back foot, stabilize the twisting hip, and then turn the left side of the chest and the right side of the rib cage, and we're home. In 5 breaths, we're home, and that's what it feels like, and it's in your memory. What do you think about? And now I always ask. In Jivamukti, we never asked. So for 10 years, everyone knew what they were getting into. This is a place where they use touch. Teacher's and I go in order to keep it really professional.
You can sign up for an in-class private at Jivamukti. where you have
that's a phenomenal experience, Leslie, to
I'm
receive
sure.
and to give, to be assisted for 90 minutes. It is super incredible. So I'm doing some experiments to back off on using it, but it's such a powerful part of my methodology. And
Sure.
Do you think it's irresponsible to in
No,
a teacher training to teach people that as a way to also teach them alignment?
no, I don't think it's irresponsible. I think it would be irresponsible to teach it without understanding the context in which people receive and experience touch.
Mhm.
Because again, if you talk about students at either end of the spectrum, you have people who have sort of, and then this would probably more relate to over here, the people I was talking about that have the dissociative, perhaps, trauma history, um, for whom touch is very, very fraught and very, very triggering, right? But then, it's coming off of COVID and the lockdowns and all that, you have people over here who are just hungering for touch,
Right.
that's what they're coming for, and to use the ethos that you use to deal with the traumatized person, to try to help the person who's traumatized by not being touched enough. The two ends are playing against the middle, and no one's a winner in that situation, and so I think it's a complicated discussion.
Do you still use it, or have you backed off as well since?
I touch people when I'm teaching workshops, but I don't adjust. Touch is different than adjusting. I think we have to maybe refine the terminology.
Assist. I use the word assist.
Assisting means that the way I would understand assisting, and the way I've seen it done, and the way I perhaps have done it in the past, is that your body as the teacher becomes part of the student's support and leverage, right? They are surrendering some of the control over their center of gravity to an external force, which is you, which can assist them in getting into a greater range of motion, or a greater sense of alignment, or stability, or whatever, right? So that's an assist. Is that different from an adjustment? Yeah, maybe. Like the person's already in a posture, and you're pushing them further.
Or adjustment implies, linguistically, it implies that there is a perfect shape they have to be in, where it's sometimes, for me, it's just about adding stability and groundedness and connecting to their breath with my bandha, their bandha.
Right. If you're coming at this conversation from that perspective that there is like an ideal shape that the student is striving for, I think that's when people get messed up.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned Iyengar, and first of all, just full disclosure, this is my teacher's uncle, right? Desikachar's mother was Iyengar's older sister, right? And Krishnamacharya, of course, did sort of initiate Iyengar into asana in a somewhat brutal fashion, if you understand the history.
He ripped his hamstrings to pieces.
Well, he did,
for a
but
demonstration.
Krishnamacharya wasn't in it for Iyengar's benefit. He was in it because he needed a demo,
a demonstration.
He needed a performer. He needed someone to perform the.
And he got a crash course in splits, which tore his body apart for a little while.
It did. And the reason, which should be remembered, the reason why he turned to Iyengar as his performer is that the other young kids who were very physically gifted, who had been performing and modeling, you can see their photos in Makaranda, right? They ran away. They just like, screw this. This guy is he's abusing us. And one by one, they just disappeared. They ran away. And so the only one who was living in Krishnamacharya's household at the time, who had no place else to go, couldn't run away, was Iyengar, his brother-in-law. And so that's, so he was trained as a performer, and he did thousands of demonstrations in those early days on a stage in front of people showing the asanas. He wasn't trained to be a teacher. He wasn't trained to be a yoga therapist. He wasn't, he was an autodidact himself. He learned everything pretty much on his own, after he left Krishnamacharya. And so, his contribution is immeasurable. There's no question about that. And this sort of laundry list of adjustments and refinements of each asana, that in order to teach it properly, you have to memorize them and able to execute them in your own body, and then you're qualified to teach them. I would say that's very Platonic, in the sense that you have this ideal form. It's an idealized form that is the goal. And here we are in our own unique individual bodies, on this plane of existence, not the world of forms. And we're trying to duplicate as closely as possible the ideal form. Why? Because when we get there, we'll get some benefit. Or maybe along the way of trying to get there, we'll get some benefit. But you're always chasing this unattainable thing, this unattainable sort of Euclidean geometric ideal, which doesn't apply to actual human anatomy at all. If you look closely at the photos in Light on Yoga, which, by the way, he almost destroyed his body producing those photos, famously. The photo shoots for that were very destructive for his body. Ask Dharma what it was like to make that poster, by the way. He'll tell you, posing for photos of asanas is not good for your body. I've seen it over and over and over again.
I can attest to that, having done a TV show.
Exactly. What looks good for the camera is not what's good for your body.
No.
But anyway, so, if you look carefully at those photos, which have become iconic, etched into people's consciousness about that's what Virabhadrasana should look like, and so on. They're not perfect. He had a human body. He could do some things better than others. His hips aren't square in Vira 1 or Vira 2. It's impossible. There's no squaring of hips. Hips don't square. There's no squares or geometric forms which have straight lines and angles. Human bodies have nothing but spirals. There's no straight lines. There's no angles. And so there's a sort of a tyranny to that approach that I never related to. And this is not to say that there aren't wonderful Iyengar trained people out there that get amazing results and are fantastic in their practice and their ability to help people, because there's a yoga for everyone. It's so diverse because people are diverse. But it never appealed to me. It always put me in like the wrong hemisphere of my brain, the one that works in this sort of linear, do this, then this, then this, then this. The language, the way it's language, it's like, I'm dyslexic, by the way. And so, if someone is saying, put your right hand on your left knee, I have a processing time lag in between actually finding my right hand before I can even figure out where it's going to get to the left knee. And if those two words have been said in close enough proximity to each other, the gears in my brain grind to a halt, and I don't know where the fuck I am. And because that's just dyslexic brain. And so I had to, I don't use the words right and left when I'm teaching or cueing either. I don't care what side people are on. I don't care which way they're facing. It doesn't matter to me, It doesn't matter if they're not breathing together either. I love a certain amount of creative chaos in the classroom, which is another way to teach, and you don't get the powerful sort of locomotive of the room breathing at the same time effect. Because I've been in those rooms, and it's fun.
Those rooms are fun. They're amazing.
Yeah, but so is staying out late and dancing and doing drugs. How long can you keep that up?
to do it all in your 20s.
Yeah, get it out of the way. Get it,
Get it out of the way.
I'm just glad that there was no internet when I was in my 20s. Oh my God. And as a yoga teacher in his 20s, if there was an internet, I would have been so screwed.
Oh, yeah. So 2 things left for me before we tie it all together. For sure, I want to ask you about how you cue Mula Bandha. There's some anatomy there and the purpose of it. I found Bandha all throughout the body, like working with a pitcher. You have to break strong with your landing leg, cross the midline, and then decelerate. There's a Bandha in the hand when you're gripping. Okay. There's certain grips for a baseball. But the root, right? When you look at the Vitruvian Man, the very central axis appears to be where we cue Mula Bandha.
You're referring to Leonardo da Vinci's famous...
Yeah, the Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian drawing.
Yeah.
How do you cue it, and what is its purpose in yoga? If you read the Bihar text, they get really tripped out on all the purification processes. And
how did that work out for Satyananda, by the way?
What's that?
How did all of that work out for Satyananda, who wrote the book?
Not well.
No.
He got into a lot of trouble. A lot of
He gave a lecture at Mars once in Los Angeles, by the way. He that's a whole other story.
Those books are still very popular, though. A lot of new teachers order them and go buy them as some authentic, you know. But from your perspective, as like what I like about your perspective is you have, when we're speaking of post lineage yoga, you do have the confer these connections with Desikachar and going back to his father Krishnamacharya. You have teachers, right, that are authentic where India's lineage comes from, the lineage of yoga, but you're so outside the box as far as how you learned in the lab of real life. We're looking at real spines, and being an autodidact gives you a chance. Leslie, great people, innovators, play outside of the rules. You know, people that are stuck in academia and have to follow the rules can only go so far. That's what I've found. And being in pro sports, working with a professional 5-doctor team taught me things that I couldn't have learned as a PhD in physical therapy program. Like, you know, I was looking at it at the highest level. When we have a guy on the disabled list, that's a $15 million arm. We need to get back on the field as soon as possible. You're working with a team of 8 to make that happen, because each day he's off is costing the owner money, and there's pressure to rehabilitate. So you learn things. So I'm curious, outside of the Indic way of looking at this idea of the root lock and its purpose, I mean, we could talk for a whole hour on it, but if you could take a few minutes just to explain the importance and the real cueing that drives it home, because the spine doesn't truly actually lengthen, but there is the energetic lengthening that comes from connecting to the root, which opens the respiratory pathway and prepares you for pranayama. Like, there is something there. If you're going to do Ujjayi and understanding the root, there's something there. But how do you connect to that and cue that and teach it to teachers?
A good challenge for a teacher who has some understanding and experience of Mula Bandha and its value would be to challenge yourself to teach it without naming it, without even naming the fact that you're teaching bandhas, right? So, and I've done that. I taught a whole workshop on breathing without, and my challenge was that day not to mention the diaphragm, and I managed to do that. I think the simplest way to contextualize a conversation about the bandhas in general and Mula Bandha in particular is to understand that it's the simple expression of Newton's third law in your along the vertical axis of your body, right? Meaning, you know, when we're perpendicular to the earth and gravity is running vertically through our system, right? Um, Here, like I'm a 66-year-old man. You want to hear what it sounds like for me to get out of and into a chair? Okay. See, how is that not bandhas? We're always doing bandhas. We're the need to coordinate the action of our diaphragms to stabilize ourselves, whether it's structurally, energetically, or emotionally, or experientially, is always there. Try to get into a bathtub of really hot water without bandhas happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, can you do that? Can you? I mean, like, you know how you make it like super hot so it doesn't cool off too, and you like, you're putting your toe in, you're going,
and sensation rides right up into
you
the
have to like lower your junk into the water, and it's like, so there's bandhas are not like a brand new alien thing that you've never done before and you learn to do the first time you experience them or are taught them in a yoga class. You've been doing this thing your whole life. You've been modulating your internal breath experience since you were born, since you started breathing. So bandha is just a way of sort of engaging in an inquiry that allows you to be more conscious of how that's working. And Mula Bandha in particular, you know, so there's this idea that let's forget about the structure and the anatomy and all of that. If we imagine that the I use a teaching toy. Well, it's in the closet. It would take me too long to find it. But imagine I'm holding a water balloon and I squeeze the bottom of the water balloon. It's going to bulge at the top, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so your abdominal cavity behaves like that water balloon. And so Mula Bandha is something that can create a squeeze at the bottom of that system, which causes a bulge at the top. And the top of the water balloon, of course, is your diaphragm. And so, and that water balloon actually comes all the way up here inside the base of your rib cage, which is why we need sort of an Uddiyana thing. Because you can't talk about Mula Bandha without Uddiyana Bandha.
They're together.
Right? They have to be, because one of them is the space that the other one has to move into. You know, if my rib cage is gripped inward and tightward, like here, and I try to squeeze at the bottom, there's no place for anything to go. So I have to be able to get
too much pressure.
Exactly. Yeah. And because the characteristic of a water balloon is that it changes its shape, but not its volume. You can't compress the water. If I'm squeezing at the bottom, the water is going to move somewhere else, right? And so, but why? Why is that important? Well, because if I want my feet to be pressing down to get my weight, my center of gravity to move up, okay, how do I more effectively get that downward force being sent towards the center of the earth? Something has to come up, right? And if I'm standing, you know, and I want to receive the full support of what the earth has to offer, where is the space in my system that support can come into? You know, so in a way it's linked to the alignment conversation from a little earlier, because what is alignment other than getting your body parts stacked up in such a way that the clearest possible pathway of weight from your body is traveling through balanced joints down to the earth? So clarifying the pathway of weight from bone to bone to bone through balanced joints, which is how I would define alignment, clarifying that as much as you can allows for the greatest return, the greatest payoff that travels in the other direction, which is support that comes from the earth. So that's just Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, you know? And so the bandhas are just part of that conversation. How do we experience and coordinate through practice or through a certain level of breath awareness during practice, these pathways of down and up, of release and support. And And on a practical level, if you want to teach them without all the cueing language, without the conversation, or even naming the bandhas, this is actually a very simple way to do that. You just play with the relationship between breath and movement. You know, like if I'm here and I inhale, right, and I exhale like that, right. So I'm just gonna step back a little. So if I inhale up and exhale down, I'm linking the breath and movement so that they're one-to-one. I start the movement, I start the breath, I start the movement, I start the breath. What if, for my exhale, I start the breath, and then I do the movement, right? So I add, on the exhale, just an extra second before I start lowering my arms, right? Where is that exhale going to come from? You know, am I going to squeeze my chest in or press down like I'm pooping, or am I going to initiate the exhale here? Right.
So are you cueing any kind of gross or subtle contraction? Is it initiating from a contraction, be it subtle or gross or energetic, or is the contraction a result of breathing and moving?
It's the result of breathing. It's the result of breathing. Because if I'm here, essentially, if I'm holding my body in an inhaled position, and then I'm saying, okay, I'm just going to exhale without changing my body shape, without moving, right?
Yeah.
Something's engaging. The real question is, where is that engagement happening and in what direction is it traveling, right? And so the technique that I would say leads to the thing we're calling Mula Bandha is to say, can I get that engagement to happen in this space between my pubic bone and my navel, and can I feel it going this way, right? And that's just from giving myself an extra second to start to initiate that exhale before I do the movement. So there's just technical, sort of very practical ways of playing with the relationship between breath and movement. For Uddiyana Bandha, it's the opposite. Like if I want to get Uddiyana Bandha, all I have to do is start this movement before I let the breath into my body. So I'm going, and then I'm inhaling. And then for the exhale, I'm exhaling first, and then I'm coming down. And that's full-on Uddiyana Mula Bandha, just from shifting the initiation of breath.
That was interesting. I teach something with that bone under the big toe to press into that, even if it's in the air, like in Warrior 3 or Ardha Chandrasana, to connect the legs to the midline. And I use this bone under the index knuckle to connect the arms to the space next to the navel for Uddiyana. So I'm trying to draw the legs and arms to the midline, because as your body's changing orientation in something like sun salutation, the head's changing orientation, your mental map of where these body parts are in space. Bodies come to yoga class initially very dull. We used to walk on the earth. We used to work on farms. We are educated sitting. We work sitting.
We're not relying on our physical capabilities to help us survive as much as we used to.
No. But they still can be trained and enlivened with great benefit using these concepts. I love what I'm going to do on Saturday is try to teach it with without any anatomy cues, or, you know.
Oh, I don't use much anatomy when I teach. That kind of makes me not, and that's why I have a hard time going.
Ironically spoken by the guy with the #1 selling anatomy book.
Yeah, but again, that puts me in the wrong hemisphere of my brain.
Yeah,
I want to be in the hemisphere that, is sort of holistically experiencing things in their wholeness and their completeness and their three-dimensionality, right? So I'm a dyslexic left-handed person. So I've got, maybe I'm hardwired for my right hemisphere to be a little more valued. I don't know, right? But that's, for me, the language needs to be used very sparingly and only to point to something that is not well expressed in the linear language, logic-based way that the left hemisphere processes information. Is very, very important. There's no question how important your left hemisphere is. Just look at Jill Bolte's Taylor, My Stroke of Insight TED Talk, and you'll see what it looks like when it goes offline, right?
Yeah.
It's very, very important. I'm not devaluing it. I'm just saying I don't want to be stuck there when I'm teaching or when I'm practicing. And I don't want the cueing I'm hearing if I'm trying to practice constantly bringing you back to, oh, do this, then this, then this. Feel the right edge of your left toenail, and then feel the energy coming up the skin of your inner right ankle and circling around you. It's like, that's just like, screw you. You know, I'm going to walk out the door if someone's teaching that way.
Yeah. People love spiritual sweet nothings whispered into their ear for an hour. they don't get that at the water cooler at the corporation. Okay. So I'm going to stay with it. I also tie in the chakras as totem. Okay. Not as necessarily Kundalini rising, the root and associated psychologies with each region. So I do talk about energy moving upwards, and I use Kapalabhati to do that. But that's another talk. I want to tie this together by asking you, you have the view that I don't. You've seen this go from non-existent to a fitness craze to where I would suppose, okay, as a body scientist myself, I would say the West has evolved yoga to some extent. Would you agree with that, given that we've produced so many fantastic, mind-blowingly great yoga teachers? And you like the direction it's going in? We have at least evolved asana, and we're starting to sieve out the guru complex. It's on you right now if you get abused by a guru, because just go to Netflix. There's 30 documentaries on all of them. And some of them start out with really authentic teachings. Like, I think Osho was teaching the real thing in the beginning. I think he
well, I don't know, but what do we mean by the real thing? I mean,
something useful, something that can be integrated, something that can relieve suffering and bring you into joy, self-acceptance.
Well, sure, but a good tango teacher can bring you there. You know, it's not as precious as I think the cultural conversation makes it out to be, because there's the whole value system, culturally, historically, religiously, from India, places people on a pedestal who any other place in the world, if they exhibited the same behavior, would be institutionalized, right? And you look at the histories of these people and how they lived and what they said, and it would have to be in that specific context to be valued the way it was. I'm not the first person to observe that there's very little difference between someone who's experiencing, schizophrenia and someone that's having a so-called enlightenment experience.
Yeah.
They're hearing voices,
it's very destabilizing. Both are
extremely destabilizing. Yeah. And so I question the whole conversation around enlightenment, and moksha and all of that. But again, that's probably for another talk. When you initially asked the question, has yoga been advanced in the West or by Westerners?
Yeah.
I imagine.
Or has the West made its own yoga? That would probably be an appropriate frame for it.
Yeah, it really depends what you mean by yoga in that question. Like, if you were to write that question out, would yoga have a capital Y or a small y? Right? Because the answer to the question will be different depending on whether you capitalized yoga or not. Are you talking about one of the darshanas, right? Which is linked to Sankhya, which is its own metaphysical view, which actually doesn't agree with Vedanta. So Desikachar was into these nuances, and when we would have these conversations, he would want you to be really specific about how you're using the word yoga. And then you amended it a little further into the question. It's like, you said asana, which, yes, as far as the asana conversation goes, the West has a lot to contribute and has contributed a lot to that conversation because of, things like the fascia research that's being done and the understanding of biomechanics and, just the realities of anatomy that we can bring to that conversation. Especially now that we've had a couple of generations practicing in ways that perhaps are not the best for the bodies. And by that, I would just point to the number of senior teachers that are having their hip joints replaced.
Yeah, or
from
hobbling off the practice floor.
who are willing to admit that, yes, it's this thing that I've been obsessively doing in my practice that contributed to needing titanium hips now. So, that's an ongoing investigation, because this generation of teachers, some of whom are contemporaries of mine and some of whom are older, those of us that are still alive, get to inhabit these aging bodies and look back and ask these questions like, has the squaring of the pelvis been a net plus or negative as far as my ability to get out of bed in the morning is concerned? Was always putting my right leg into lotus first and the left leg second something that contributed to the health of the meniscus in my left knee?
Yeah.
Right. So these are great questions, and because we're not bound by the religious, cultural, traditions that were present in yoga's original context, we can be iconoclastic. But, Krishnamacharya was an iconoclast too. He was, on the one hand, a master of the tradition and a defender of the tradition. But when his own insights contradicted with stuff that was considered traditional knowledge, he had no compunction about, calling it out.
That's why this parampara thing is a little tricky, because it's like, of course you would, as something is passing down through history. Like, I practiced Jeet Kune Do as a kid in my 20s, Bruce Lee's martial art.
Bruce Lee's martial art, cool.
Yeah, and so there was a great placard on the wall that said, take what is interesting, reject that which is not, and add that which is your own. Yeah. And that, I etched that on my consciousness for every discipline I've ever studied, because at a certain point, you're going to have insights. Like, you're told to teach something because of a dogma, but if it's repeating incorrectly over months, years, it's going to cause a problem within that body. Like you said, the squaring of the hips, we can look at the net effect of that data now and be a little more honest about how we approach our yoga programming. And also, as I think about sustainable practices, like, I like not having a 167-pound body, and like, what are the asanas that I want to keep practicing? How will I continue to practice? And to stay enthusiastic about it is, as it evolves through time, and not be attached to what it used to do, is a brilliant personal journey.
That's a big one. That's a big one. Because there can be a very strong longing for what we were able to do in the past, and if we're kind of striving in that direction in the present moment when we practice, it does not bode well for the future, because we're not being present, and that's sometimes the hardest thing to do.
I get jealous of my my clients and students. Some of them, I laugh really hard. I go, I see people that pay me tons of money to learn yoga as a utility and a way that benefits their life. And I tell them how beautiful that is. You get to be a student while you do something else. And here I am, and sometimes in total immersion with my practice and running a yoga business. It's a head trip. And it's a whole nother thing that can also bring you out of the practice, where when it's in these bite-sized chunks over many years and insights come, it's also very poetic to use the practice in a way that serves you than thinking you have to get it all today because you teach it. I'm learning to be more with the process as I mature as a teacher.
Yeah. And, exactly. And we've been inhabiting aging bodies our entire lives.
Yeah.
But we don't call it an aging body until we're past the point where, we're still developing and growing, and we get to that plateau for a while, and then where I draw the line. And I remember when this happened. You know how when you were young, at the end of the day, you were tired and you would lie down and fall asleep, and then you'd wake up and you'd start your day, and that was all the thought you had to give to it, right?
Yeah.
Did that
Yeah.
stop at a certain point when at the end of the day you were tired and you had to lie down and then you had to go, oh, like how high is this pillow and how will it support my head so my neck doesn't get stiff and cause my arm to fall asleep? And where's my special pillow that's going between my knees so my lower back's not going to get screwed up? Like I define that period of life as when you realize that it's becoming increasingly possible to fuck yourself up in your sleep.
Mm-hmm. Never thought of that.
Yeah, well, I've been there for a while, and I have special pillows and a wedge and all of that.
Yeah, I have the one between the legs, which
there
is
you
very
go.
helpful.
Yeah, when did you start needing that? When did you start needing that?
That's about 7 or 8 years ago. I started needing that.
That's when you started inhabiting an aging body. That's what I would say, just on a practical level.
That's a great clue. So where I know that you've taken over the Zoom space and you're very proficient with tech. Where can people practice with you, and what are you offering digitally as a resource for yoga teachers who might listen to this on YouTube and
sure
audio platforms?
Thank you for asking and allowing me to promote a little bit. The second part of the question, the resources that support yoga teachers and yoga teacher trainings, actually, because we have an anatomy module that supply, and it's the only one that's fully approved by the Yoga Alliance, by the way, to give all the support that's needed to complete their anatomy requirement for a teacher training program. And that's at yogaanatomy.net. We call that program Fundamentals. And then there's 2 other programs called Principles and Practices that are at yogaanatomy.net. And we've had those courses up there for, the first one went up over 14 years ago. So we were kind of early adopters on that. And the rest of my stuff you can find on my personal website, which is yogaanatomy.org. So yogaanatomy.org and yogaanatomy.net.
That has the breathing courses that you teach?
Well, all of my stuff is accessible through links on the personal website, which is yogaanatomy.org. So whatever I'm offering, you can find there, including the .NET courses that I mentioned. So,
yeah. Right. Thank you, Leslie Kaminoff.
It's been a pleasure, Jai. Do you know one of my sons' name is Jai? I think I told you that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is he the oldest one?
He's the middle son.
The middle son.
We asked Jessica Char to help name him, and he said, name him Prem. And I thought, well, that's a cool name. As you know, it means love, but I didn't want him to grow up with that much of a burden. So that's his middle name. His middle name is Prem, and his first name is Jai. So, and I always thought if he just wanted to ditch the whole my parents are yoga teachers thing, he'd just be JP.
I'm curious, are they interested in yoga, or is that your thing?
My oldest son, yes, he went through the Shivananda teacher training in Trivandrum, India, which, that's where I did my sannyas, in Trivandrum at the Nayardam ashram, north of Trivandrum, actually. And he did my anatomy course in New York, and he did Jay Brown's teacher training, and he's worked with Mark Whitwell. So he's the most highly trained yoga teacher I know who's never really taught yoga. That's my oldest son. And my middle son, Jai, he's a music guy. He's guitar tech. He travels around. And I think I can say it now. It's not that big a secret. And when is this going to air?
I'll probably have the audio up. I'm shooting for Sunday.
Oh, okay. Because it's supposed to be Hush Hush, but the band that he works with, I won't name the band, but anyway, they're a French band, and they're going to be part of the opening ceremonies for the Olympics in Paris. So he's about to travel to Paris to do their
phenomenal. What a cool gig.
Yeah. So he's he's like a guitar roadie, and he lives in Houston, running a guitar repair shop when he's not on the road. And
so it's the little one that lives in Manhattan.
Well, he's not so little. He's 6'3", but his name is Alex, or Sasha, as I call him, and he's a videographer, and he's the one who has stayed closest to home, and he's right now he's on his way down to visit with the rest of the family in New Hope, Pennsylvania. But he's the one who has been living part-time with me and getting established as a videographer. So. Yeah. He's the one with all the tattoos. So.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning into that enlivening conversation with Leslie Kaminoff, a yoga scientist, a yoga innovator, and in some ways a yoga historian in the West. He's got this grand arc of the evolution of yoga and the adaptation of yoga from India into its Western form. So thank you, Leslie, for coming on and sharing your knowledge. You can look at the link in the show notes to follow up with Leslie and study further with him. And again, please consider becoming a patron of this show. You can go to patreon.com/Jai Sugrum and become a supporter of the show, which will unlock unique benefits like being able to practice with me digitally live on Zoom every week. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and I wish you an amazing, super duper, spectacular rest of your day. Take care.